Hey there, it's Gabrielle Nicolay with Speech Kids and Raising Orchid Kids, and I am joined today by Meghan McAteer. That's how you pronounce it, right, Meghan?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
And we are going to talk about feeding and transitioning to solids. But before we do that, Meghan, would you tell the good people who you are and what you do and all the things?
Yeah, my name is Meghan McAteer. I'm the owner of Splendid Speech Therapy. We do a lot of feeding therapy, myofunctional therapy, and just, articulation and speech and language therapy as well. It's just me and a few other contractors, and we are slowly but surely growing. So this is exciting.
And you're in the DC area, yeah?
We are in the DC area. We work at the Just For Me OT office as well in Rockville, Maryland.
Nice. Okay. And you're seeing people in person and virtually, or?
We're doing virtual and home visits too.
Okay. Very nice.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about this transition to feeding and when we talk about transitioning, feeding transition, we're talking about transitioning from puree to solids. Yes.
Yeah. Or
More
from
solid
bottle
food.
and breast to puree and solids.
Okay. So
as
walk
well.
us through, what is that supposed to look like?
Well, it can look like a lot of different things. I think the most important thing that we need to think about when we start building a plan on how to do this with our families is, first of all, not to freak out. Because the more freaking out that we all do, the more kind of weird reinforcers we have already created, and you never know how long those weird, quirky reinforcements last into toddlerhood. And even I've seen 7 and 8-year-olds with some issues with picky eating that really started way before when we were first introducing solids. So
I'm gonna back you up.
yeah.
I'm going to back us both up, because when we start thinking about feeding, early feeding, especially, and I asked you, like, what is it supposed to look like, right?
Right.
We're going to talk about treatment in a second, but really what I want the good folks at home to know is it's supposed to look effortless.
No.
Right? Oh, hold on a second. Oh, good. I'm so glad you're cutting me off. But when we have typical feeding in place,
Yes.
is what I'm saying, right?
Yes.
In terms of infant and child development, kids learn to eat.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
They pop onto a breast, they pop onto a bottle, they suck it down, everything goes well.
Yep.
Generally speaking.
Generally speaking.
Okay. What we're talking about, and then I'm going to fast forward a little bit, right? When we get ready to switch them at some point around 6 months, right? We give them some solids and they go, and they swallow it. Nothing dramatic happens. They have some food preferences, but they pretty much eat what you give them. Those are not the people we're talking about here.
Yeah, no. And that's the idea, right? That we give them a little food, they like it. We keep giving different foods, they like it. But then something happens, right? Maybe some sort of thing that is actually very normal happens. And the parent says, oh my goodness, you don't like that food. Either the child gagged, or they threw something on the floor, or they just decided to play with it. And then all of a sudden we've labeled this food as bad. We put it on the bad list. Child does not like it. When in actuality, they probably just needed to see it again, or play with it again, or have another exposure.
How many exposures until a food is accepted?
For typical developing children, around 12.
12
times.
And for kids,
and that doesn't mean like 12 days in a row. That means you give it one day, then maybe on 3 days later, then maybe 2 days later, sometimes at lunch, sometimes at dinner, depending on where you are in your transitioning process.
And then for kids who maybe have a little bit of a sensory processing issue, or any kind of other developmental issue, or they had a bad experience with that particular food, how many?
Minimum 20. Minimum of 20. And I've seen children that might need 50,
Yeah.
which does happen.
And so I think that alone, that is a tiny nugget of information of what we're going to talk about here. But like, just keeping that in mind in terms
Mhm.
of just how many times we want to be giving kids experience with novelty, right?
Yes, yes.
They're new. They don't know.
Everything is new. Um, yeah. So, and also, especially when you have new parents, they have just, I think, like, you know, some people will start solids at 4 months, which is not typically what I recommend, but some people decide with their pediatrician, that's what they do, or 6 months. And I feel like that's the age range where parents really feel like they're beginning to get it. Baby's beginning to sleep anymore. They're a little bit rested. They feel like they're really getting the hang of it. Feedings are going well. They're out of the house more. And then the pediatrician hands you this piece of paper saying to start solids.
Like, great, we can breathe. Oh no, we have this
Great.
whole new.
Oh no, we have this whole big challenge that can be very scary. Gagging is like a normal reflex that a lot of parents can misinterpret as choking. And so there is a little more groundwork to do outside of that pediatrician handout that I feel like could make parents really feel at ease and become pros at transitioning to solids.
And so now we kind of have arrived back where I interrupted you, I don't know, 10 minutes ago,
That's
which
okay.
was,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, no, but when we're getting ready to do this and pick me up from there,
Yeah.
is and I've completely lost my train of thought. That was segging very, very seamlessly into
That's
this
okay.
next question, which
I think what
completely
we're talking about maybe is prerequisites.
Thank
When
you.
do you want to start solids, right?
Yeah, good. Thank you.
And this can be very confusing because the recommendations by pediatricians has changed over the years. We went from, in the last 100 years, if you take that alone, in the 1920s, the recommended age was 6 months. And then with the introduction of formula and canning and jarring and refrigeration, all of a sudden you get to the 1950s, and the recommendation is, I think I read somewhere like 6 weeks.
Oof.
Something very early.
Yeah.
And then from the 1950s on, the recommendation keeps going up, up, up. And now we're back at 6 months again, 100 years later. So
in case you wondered if these
in
things are at
case
all
you're wondering why
culturally
it's so,
driven.
yeah, in case you're wondering why it's so confusing, that is a lot of the reason, because you definitely have family members saying, well, I did this, I did that, and that's the way it's done. And so there has been a lot of change, and we're just in a different place right now with it all. But we're back at 6 months, which I think is a great age. And sometimes I'm not even looking at age when it comes to transitioning to solids. We're looking at skill.
Yeah, like what?
Yeah.
Skills like what?
Number one, are we interested at all? When mom and dad is shoving a sandwich in their mouth, are you trying to grab that sandwich too? Are you looking at it? Is the baby interested in it? The next huge thing is core stability.
Why does core stability matter in feeding, Megan?
Core stability matters for several reasons, but I'll just go into like kind of the basics of it. If you think about like a foundation for a house, core stability is your foundation. Think of like a roof as your jaw and it moving, and some other things going on in the house are your lips and your tongue, right? So if you don't have a good foundation, you have to start all over again. Sitting in a high chair.
Most high chairs are terrible.
Yes, most high
Particularly
chairs
those
are.
IKEA ones.
Yes, and any high chair that I would say has dangling feet. If you think of like a bar stool or something, like you're eating at a bar and the stool or chair is a little wobbly,
Mhm.
you're not really fully able to eat your meal or drink your drink without trying to without trying to tip with avoiding tipping over,
Avoiding tipping over.
excuse me.
And
Yeah,
that's okay. And you're using an adult example, which I really like to
right,
do, because like people will remember the feeling of like having to adjust yourself in your chair.
right.
But then
Yeah.
if and you have those skills,
Yes.
you're making those adjustments. Now we're thinking
Right.
about your average
Yeah.
6-month-old, 8-month-old who doesn't have those skills.
No.
They
Right.
don't have the ability to correct, and they don't have the underlying foundation to be able to have the jaw stability that they need in order to nom 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 nom, which is why we're going back
Exactly.
to core and back
Yep.
to legs being flat.
Mm-hmm.
And you do the 90 90 90. Yeah, I always
Yep.
say
I
you
do
want everything at a 90 degree.
everything's at 90 degrees. Baby's upright, the knees are out and supported at 90 degrees as well.
Yeah. So positioning really matters for littles when we're
Positioning does matter because it gives
Mhm.
them so much more freedom to move their arms, to move their mouth, to be able to reach for something and bring it,
and then
to
move
play
them.
with it, to
Okay, we got
throw
to
the
stop
food.
here. Megan, you are
I
telling people
know.
to let their kids play with their food. WTF? What's going on?
Absolutely.
Why? Why should kids play with their food?
Um, well, it's the same reason we talk about playing in any form of development. Playing with toys develops fine motor muscle, gross motor muscles, playing at the table. And I'm not saying bring toys to the table or anything like that. Although we'll sometimes I do.
But we don't want you to do that, parents.
Yes.
We want the professionals to bring the
Let the
toys.
professionals bring the toys to the table. But really sitting in the high chair, having that core stability, and then being able to interact with food appropriately, touch it, smell it, sit there in the kitchen while you're cooking it, possibly, if you can get that. That way you have that extra sensory experience, is just so important to explore and play. And
So often what happens is when families perceive that their children are having difficulty transitioning to solids. So purees are going great. They love their pouches. Okay, we'll talk about pouches another time.
yeah,
No pouches,
that's a
please.
different day.
That's a different day. But it's been going well. They like a bunch of different tastes. They've been incorporating this. Sometimes what happens, and we get a lot of these too, the minute you transition to a piece of food, kiddo is going, and parents are perceiving that that's difficult, which it probably is. Can you talk a little bit about that moment of transitioning into texture?
Yeah. Typically, I think once you get, a lot of parents will do like a teeny tiny piece.
Yeah.
And we don't have the skills for teeny tiny pieces yet to move our tongue around in that direction. So typically what happens when we give these teeny tiny pieces, we gag.
Yeah.
We gag, or we might even choke
Mhm.
because we don't have the skills to do a teeny tiny piece. But what we do have the skill to is probably like a larger piece. I always recommend sticks of anything. If baby
Why?
can't, sticks are great because they're easy to pick up. They're easy to munch on. They dissolve in a certain way. Typically, babies put them on the side, which can help decrease that gag reflex and help that gag reflex diminish over time.
That's super interesting. And I think that is another nugget that parents are going to be very surprised to learn, which is maybe the piece of food that I'm offering my baby is too small.
Yes.
That is a kind of a mind blower.
Yeah. And I think the instinct is, well, the tinier the piece, the less likely they will choke, right?
Yeah.
And all of our teeny tiny airways are only the size of a chickpea. So the smaller it is, to the size, the more likely it's going to go in there if it does get past that gag reflex.
Yeah. Interesting. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. So many questions. Okay.
Yeah.
So if parents, I think the first thing we're coming to here is like lots of repetitions, and gagging is okay.
Yeah.
And it's okay if kiddo goes to swallow something and spits it back out.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And so what you start, what I now remember what I was saying before, which was when sometimes what happens, and you were talking about sort of reinforcing certain behaviors earlier. Sometimes what happens is that we as parents get really freaked out because we're like, they're gagging, they're choking.
Yes.
And we make a big show, inadvertently, of course.
Yeah, of course.
And then kiddo takes notice and they're like, I notice that when I do this big action, something awesome happens. I want more of that.
Yes, I want more.
So I'm going to do more gagging. I'm going to do more, right? I'm
not in any danger, right? There's no sense of danger when they're gagging.
Right. Oh. And yet the sense of danger maybe has come from mom's very big reaction to that. So then there's so it can cut both ways. So gagging, normal. If you see your child gagging and they're not in distress, they've just sort of spit out their food, we can remain calm. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. The biggest thing I think is to practice that neutral face and just taking a deep breath. Yeah. And not really labeling anything.
Yeah. So instead of saying, I do this with
that was too big for you. That was icky. You don't like it. What you must not like things that are green.
Oh, Lordy. Right. So what can we say instead?
I personally say nothing. Like most of the time, I might just leave the food on the tray and keep it moving. If there are multiple things on the tray, we'll just kind of move on to something else and then go back to it.
Keeping in mind that 12 to 20 or 50 exposures.
Yes, exactly. Right. And that you get another chance the next meal, the next day, 3 days later, whatever you choose your comfort level is.
Yeah. I think that at the end of the day, there is no end of the day. I could sit here and talk to you all day.
I know. I could do this.
I'm going to wrap this up, right?
Yeah.
Which is, most kids will transition to solids very easily. Some kids will have some trouble adjusting. And for those kids, your parental reaction is going to be really important.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Armed with some information about what might happen, hopefully those kiddos can sort of make it through with the support of a calm and aware adult. Yes. There are going to be children who end up on our caseloads who need to be seen for a feeding evaluation and treatment.
Yes.
And you want a speech language pathologist, a licensed speech language pathologist with experience in feeding. Because that's not all the same, which is a whole other thing.
Yeah, not the same. I think is definitely the first line.
And you want to do that earlier rather than later, because as you were saying, Megan, that behavioral piece, whatever's going on underneath is what's causing a feeding difficulty.
Right.
So I don't know where the food is because I can't feel it. I gag, I can't breathe and swallow at the same time. We don't want to breathe and swallow at the same time, but I can't coordinate.
I hear you.
Can't coordinate my breathing and my swallowing, right? So there's some underlying thing happening for kids who are having true feeding difficulties. But then there's this whole behavioral piece that gets layered on top, and that gets worse, even though the symptoms might get better.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And I think pediatricians are they're okay as long as the baby has a good enough weight. they're fine.
Mhm.
And there are no other issues.
Mhm.
They're pretty much okay with whatever is happening for the most part. The baby gags, you're like, well, are they happy during meals? Then it's okay.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
if the parent feels there's excessive gagging, it's just better to go ahead and make that call to someone in the field, such as a speech pathologist that specializes in this area. And that's probably your first line if something truly is going on. I feel like the speech pathologist is the person who's going to take a really big case history and maybe send you to someone else
Mhm. Yep.
in conjunction. If the problem is even that much, you could come see a speech pathologist and say, you know what, you sound like you're on the right track.
Mhm.
Let me help you try these things.
Yep. Um, if you have a 2-year-old who's still insisting on milk and pouches,
Yes.
that's a problem
Yes.
that we want to look at. And
Yeah.
you want to implement a feeding plan.
Yes.
And you probably want help to do it, because if your kiddo is 2 and you haven't quite figured out how to make that happen, that's an issue. And I'm
That's an
saying
issue.
2, how far back would you go? Because I actually think 2 is kind of late.
I think 2 is kind of late too. I'm actually going to say 1.
Okay.
Because there is like a little body of research saying if you don't implement foods that you use to chew at all by like 9 months,
Mm-hmm.
then you kind of have, it's not a critical window, I would say, but it's going to be much harder for you once you do introduce more texture.
Yep. And keep in mind, right? Feeding is a multi-sensory experience. This is why we want
Yeah.
kids playing with their food, because it has a feel and it
Yeah.
has a smell and it has a
Yes.
taste, which is highly related to smell. But it has a feel when it's outside your body, and it has
Mhm.
a feel when it's inside your mouth,
Yes.
and then it has a feel when it's in your belly,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so getting all of that, I mean, I say this all the time, Megan, it's like, it is a miracle that any of us is walking around upright with clothes on, talking to each other. I mean, like,
Yeah.
how does this happen?
Yeah.
And feeding is the same way. It is there.
Eating is the same.
It's comprised of these minuscule and yet myriad skills that get us to, like, yeah, you can just order a hamburger and eat it.
Yeah.
That's hard.
It is hard. It is hard. And I find a lot of families sometimes, as speech language pathologists, obviously we're talking about speaking too when we're talking to families and those skills, the communication skills. And I find that, some families don't mind if their children can't talk, but they do mind if their child is not eating,
Mm-hmm. And
not eating
I often have the
healthfully.
reverse.
Oh, really? I have the other.
Yeah.
That's just been my experience.
Yeah. But it's true. We don't think of them as being related. And in fact, I had a conversation this morning with a parent where I said, yeah, I want you to send me a video of him eating. And she was like, why? And I said, well, because the muscles that we use for eating, are the same muscles that we use for speech. And she had mentioned that he was sort of becoming a picky eater. Also, no surprise, he's a late talker.
Right.
Right. So those two things, they're not the same, but there's overlap there.
Yeah.
And
the
so,
development of those skills are certainly very similar with needing the core stability
yep.
and the experiences and the motor skills.
We're going to do
Very
another one of
similar.
these, but
Yeah.
we're going to pin it there. Thank you so
Perfect.
much for coming.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
So fun. If people want to get a hold of you, where do they do that?
You can go to my website, splendidspeechtherapy.com.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.